If you've wondered what it would be like to visit the wild horses in the wildest of places, Sable Island, this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker, and let's get started. Welcome to the Freedom for Wild Horses podcast, the place to find out about wild horses in the American West and what you can do to help them stay wild and free. If you love wildlife, wild horses, and the freedom that they stand for, this show is for you. I'm your host, Carol Walker. Let's get started. Imagine a place with an island made of sand, stretching for miles, with dunes riding up and long green grass and flowers waving in the constant breeze. On Sable Island, wild horses and the largest gray seal colony on Earth are the only mammals, aside from the few humans staying on Main Station. From the moment I first heard about Sable Island over 20 years ago, I was captivated and determined to go. Wild horses, living on a remote island and adapted to that place, moving on beaches, in the water, and across dunes sounded irresistible. There are currently only two ways to visit the island, by air or by sea, and last week was my third time visiting Sable Island. Parks Canada took over the management of Sable Island in 2013 and has tightly regulated visitation since then. Only 500 visitors are allowed per year. No one gets to stay overnight, but only visit during the day. This was my second trip with the tour company Katuk Expeditions, with the owner Fred Stillman leading our group of 7 adventurers across the dunes in search of wild horses and seals. We had our shoes disinfected before we boarded the helicopter to prevent introducing biohazards to the fragile ecology of the island. The trip of almost 200 miles from Halifax Airport to the helipad at Main Station took over an hour and a half. And as we flew over, eagerly looking for a first glimpse of the island, it finally came into view. As we approached, we came in over the tip where there was just sand, and as we got closer to the center of the island, I saw seals on the beach and finally wild horses on the dunes. I was delighted to see, as we gently sat down, that there were many wild horses close to Main Station. Once we had an orientation from Parks Canada and collected our gear, we were ready to set out. I heard that over 100 horses had been lost last year because of Hurricane Fiona. So the population was down from a high of 580 to now probably about 450 wild horses. The population on the island has fluctuated from 150 to a high of 580 over the past few decades, due primarily to weather conditions. It's a harsh and unforgiving place to live, with the winds sometimes 100 miles per hour in the winter. And there are also hurricanes that impact the island. The horses know where to shelter, at the base of dunes or inland, but when their food sources are impacted, the population declines. When I talked to Zoe Lucas, the naturalist who has spent the most time studying the horses on the island, she told me that the foal mortality rate was about 40%. This is the highest I've ever heard of for wild horses. There's no population control enforced by man on the island. Nature takes care of that. As we walked along a horse path over the dunes, I noticed the beautiful yellow flowers in bloom and the lushness of the green grass. I also saw a horse skull, which had been there a long time because there was yellow lichen growing on it. We headed to one of the many freshwater ponds on the island, as they are usually great places to find horses. On our way, we spotted a brown stallion with a long mane looking out over the dunes, no doubt at another family nearby. The horses saw us and returned to grazing, entirely unconcerned by our presence. The horses here have not been molested or interfered with or captured by man since the 1950s, so they had no fear of us. We had a 60-foot distance we had to maintain from them so that they would be able to go about their normal activities, right now included mostly grazing. It was very quiet, except for the faint sound of the ever-present breeze, the teeth of the horses working on the grass, and our shutters clicking. So very peaceful. After spending time with his family, we continued to walk on to the pond where a bay stallion and 2 mares with a fuzzy foal were grazing. The foal then began nursing, and his coat was thick and velvety, preparing him for his first winter. One of the stallions stayed close to the family, and the other was further out on the perimeter. I did not see any fighting between them, or tension actually, and I could not figure out if the second stallion was a past member of the family, or if he were following them, hoping to steal the mares. Most of the wild horses on the island are bay, or brown, or black, and there are a few palominos and sorrels sprinkled in. Each of the horses has a name that is used to identify them, and they are monitored in studies at Saskatchewan University. They're in the midst of a 30-year research program about the wild horses here, which includes observing and recording behavior, relationships, health, habitat selection, genetics, diet, and other factors. The researchers do not interfere with the horses, but come once a week in the summer to observe them. No one gives them medical treatment, nor do they euthanize horses that may have sustained a mortal injury or illness. Nature takes its course here. We stayed with this family for a while, and had to move as they made their way along the horse path, and then watched them finally walk down to the beach. The fuzzy foal ran to keep up with Mom, and I smiled as he leaped over a small sandhill. I could see several other horses in the distance, some stallions by themselves, and other small families who perhaps had already drunk from the freshwater pond. We headed back to Main Station for lunch, and on the way, I saw one of the elusive sorrel mares in the distance, and a stallion on high alert as another family moved to the pond. We sat at a picnic table for our lunch, staying outside with a beautiful breeze and the gorgeous view. After lunch, we headed out to the ponds on the other side of the station, walking on the dunes and then down on the beach where the water had wet the sand. There are no roads, and so walking through the sand is a challenge, especially carrying a camera, so I was grateful for the firmer wet sand. I was charmed by seeing little teeny hoof prints in the sand alongside bigger ones. A family with a foal had walked this way earlier in the day and left this sign behind, which would soon be covered over by the sea. We topped a hill that had a great view of several ponds, and I could see horses all around. Heaven. The nearest group had a stallion, 2 mares, a yearling, and 2 foals, and the stallion and foals were lying down taking a nap, enjoying the beautiful sunny day. As we approached, the stallion got up, and I could see 2 other stallions nearby. The stallions who do not have a family, bachelors, will often hang out together, always on the lookout for some mares to steal, and they'll often play and groom each other. There were 3 here, but they moved on, so we watched the family. One mare and her daughter groomed each other and then returned to grazing. Then over the hill, a small family with 2 mares and a stallion headed down the same horse trail we were standing on, and the young bay mare in the lead seemed very interested in us. She kept coming closer and closer, following us as we kept backing up, trying to maintain our 60-foot distance. She watched us the whole time we were there. The rest of our group decided to head up on the dunes and walk along to see if any horses or anything else was along the beach, and I elected to stay with the horses, since they were why I was there. I found a good place to sit and watched and felt the rhythm of the island around me. There were birds and the small family, and in the distance I heard whinnies. It was so quiet, such a contrast to modern life. My phone was not connected to anything, and only good for recording videos. The horses were spread out at different areas, some coming to the ponds to drink, some were grazing, others were napping. When the rest of the group returned, we walked to where the family with the foals had gone. The bay stallion walked up the dune to get a view, while keeping his eye on his family below at the pond. When they disappeared, the group headed out again to scout, and I stayed behind above one of the ponds. I almost fell asleep sitting in the tall grass, with the wind in my hair and the sun on my face. A black stallion, all by himself, was standing resting, and finally he decided to walk by. My favorite encounter the whole trip was when an older black stallion with an amazing long tangled mane, following his 3 mares, walked along the rim of the pond straight toward me. The mares turned to follow the path around the pond, and I held my breath as the stallion stopped and looked at me for a couple of minutes. There was such deep wisdom in his eyes, a knowledge of this island, the horses, the sand, the sea, and life, and it moved me down to my toes. This is what these horses can teach us. They are a part of their world, in tune with it, and when they die, their bodies become part of the island, nourishing the plants that feed the next generation. That stallion is Sable Island. Soon after my encounter with his family, the rest of the group came back, and a stallion and a foal were on the beach, scratching themselves on a metal piece that had washed up on the beach. Given that there's only one tiny bit of a tree left on the island, the horses are very happy to find something to scratch themselves on. There's always something washing up on the beach, and given that there are over 350 wrecks around the island, the graveyard of the Atlantic is an apt name. The island is 26 miles long and only less than a mile wide. It's just a drop in the ocean. As we walked down the beach, back toward Main Station, we saw a black stallion and a bay mare in the distance walking together. When we got closer, Fred pointed out that the saltwater pool in front of them looked like a heart. I wondered how long these two had been together. They seemed devoted and stuck very close to each other. When we headed back out on the helicopter, I reflected on what makes this place, these horses, so special. In the 1950s, they were going to remove all the horses from the island, but there was an outcry from the public, and so the horses were allowed to remain, and they are now protected. They live their entire lives on this island. They grow up with their families, and then form families of their own. They're not chased by helicopters. They're not trapped and sent to holding facilities full of diseases they have no defenses against, and then possibly sent to slaughter. They are subject to the wind and the waves and the sand where they live, but they are not in competition with livestock for forage. They embody freedom and inspire those lucky enough to visit and spend time in their presence. This is what I want for our wild horses here in America. Protection so that they might live their lives wild and free with their families, and die free, becoming part of the land that nourished them. They should be managed in the least invasive way possible by people who put their welfare and health and freedom first. This is what I am fighting for. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. Go to my podcast page at www.wildhoofbeats.com to see links and photos of the horses. Thank you for listening to this episode of Freedom for Wild Horses. If you want to learn more, follow me at www.wildhoofbeats.com for more information and for ways to help America's wild horses. See you next time.